I was recently having a discussion with a friend who was talking about a friend who basically became a victim of classic monkey branching. Now, this friend of mine was not aware of the term, but essentially, this friend of his had a girlfriend. She had a guy on the back burner and broke up with the guy, and a week later was together with a new guy and has since moved in with him. And this was a while back, but at the time, everyone was very puzzled by this behavior, etc., etc. And I pointed out to him this is pretty normal. This is simply a reproductive strategy that people, specifically women, employ. And this led to an entire discussion about how I personally see things very clinically, and that he too can see things clinically, but he finds it a lot more difficult in personal social situations because he's an actual scientist, and within a scientific frame, he can see things clinically. But he finds it very difficult to abstract away from that to look at day-to-day matters and day-to-day behavior in a clinical fashion. And I pointed out to him that that is, by now, essentially in my nature. That after years of looking at human behavior and the sexes, and in general, human motivation, it's very difficult to look at human beings in the typical pollyannaish manner that most people are accustomed to. And this very often rubs people the wrong way, which is another reason why, to be perfectly honest, a lot of people I encounter don't like me off the bat because I'm not really able to divorce myself from the clinical perspective I take to look at the world, and specific to look at human beings. But where does this ultimately come from? Now, a long time ago, very long ago in fact, I made the statement, you can either love women or you can understand them. And I still believe that's true. But I want to expand that beyond the concept of women and look at human beings and human behavior more broadly. I think in general, when it comes to the human, things we take for granted, basic human behaviors, our interactions, our personalities, and our motivations, there is a very strict dividing line. It is one thing to work off of assumptions of how humans operate that are not based in reality, that are based on wishful thinking and ideals that you will simply not encounter when actually looking at the facts. An entirely different thing to essentially look at human beings as just another animal, an ape, as I like to say. And that's how I look at things. Now, in general, human beings have a whole bunch of things pre-programmed into us that could be regarded as almost automatic. So it's an automaticity that I can produce speech or that I can walk. Now, an exercise kinesiologist might, for example, be able to take the movement of my legs and examine all the muscle interactions and talk about ATP and then glycogen metabolism and go into all the details of what's actually happening. But none of that is, in fact, required for me, at least at this moment, to be able to get up and walk someplace. Likewise, a speech pathologist might be able to go into some of the details of that stuff, but it's not required for the average person to produce some kind of speech. And so it goes with most human features. Most human features are inherent to us, and we're perfectly capable of getting by without delving into the details as to why. Some people can do that. Like I said, that exercise kinesiologist can go into all the details of how your musculature works when it's exercising and when you're walking. And the speech pathologist can do the same thing. An endocrinologist can tell you all about the peptide hormones and sex hormones in your body. They can do these things. However, it's not a requirement. But most people are not terribly bothered when an exercise kinesiologist says, look, this is the way your legs work when you're walking. When you're sprinting, that happens. And when you're lifting heavy weight above your head, that's what happens. They're not terribly bothered by that. They might not be very interested, but they're not bothered by it. A speech pathologist explaining problems in speech production, positioning of the tongue, where things are articulated. Most people find that incredibly boring, but they're not bothered by that. They won't find that very interesting, the average individual, but nonetheless, they're not bothered by it. But here's the great outlier. Among all these things, descriptive models of human behavior bother people a lot because human beings operate in this dichotomous fashion whereby we have a fairy tale world that we've woven around ourselves for the sake of ourselves and others that we cleave to in order to, one might argue, keep society going. And then we have the underlying reality, which always tends to bite us in the buttocks when we're least expecting it, by the way. And this is where I think the clinical, analytical element of things comes into play and why it's so important ultimately. And I do think that human beings have sort of signed a pact in silence, that we will not actively talk about how human beings actually operate because they think it's necessary. But here's the thing. After being in this space for so long, I don't know how to look at human beings in the typical Pollyannish fashion. I just don't. And I think ultimately it's probably more valuable, at least as some individuals do, because as we all know, people say one thing and they do another thing. There's a reason why there's that Bible quote, by their deeds you shall know them, right? Because people's actions often do speak louder than their words. That specifically in this context is very important because, classic example, right? Women say they want one thing, but they go after another thing, right? They say one thing because for the sake of social approval, it sounds a lot better. So they might say, I want somebody who's humorous and is nice and kind, but in reality, they'll go after some guy who is a bit of an a-hole and very tall and wealthy and looks really good and doesn't have any of these qualities. And that's not unique or remarkable. That's just one example amongst many. And I think it actually is important to be clinical about these things. How many problems could we solve if we actually took an honest, unbiased view at human beings, as best as we can be, rather than pretending that we're things that we're not? And this has gotten me into hot water on more than one occasion. I think I might have told you this story, but a while back, I was in a situation where there were a bunch of women and a guy. One guy was complaining. He was short, probably not that attractive, decent salary. He wasn't able to meet any woman, and he's tried, and da-da-da. And one of the girls blurted out something to the effect of, oh, you'll find something. There's somebody out there for everybody. I'm sure it's not because you're too short. I'm sure you've just had bad luck. And I really dug down there, and I pointed out, well, this guy is only 5'5", and he's at a real disadvantage here in the mating market right now. And she said, well, height isn't everything. And I promptly asked her, well, how tall is your boyfriend? 6'2"? And I asked her, do you think that's a coincidence? And then she started equivocating, and I asked her, would you be willing to date a guy who's 5'5"? And she waited a long time, and she was forced to say, no, I wouldn't. Well, there you have it. And she was angry at me. She was angry at me for getting her to speak the truth. In the same sense that a criminal or a thief who has robbed a store might get upset at someone for forcing them to acknowledge the theft, she got upset that I was able to convince her to say, no, I wouldn't date a 5'5" tall guy. I mean, where's the sin in that? You see, we have these strange protocols. People don't like the clinical, but ultimately it's the clinical that defines us in our day-to-day interactions and how we think and go about our business in the world. It's not the veneer of civility and acceptable etiquette that we've established that is the actual truth. It's what's underneath it. And this guy, by the way, was not being helped by being sold and told a pack of lies. I don't know how else to be in terms of my behavior, but I can tell you after dozens of incidents that people, even men, but especially women, don't like the clinical. They don't like when you're analytical and take people apart, even though I think human beings are fair game. I often ask this question, ethology, the study of animal behavior. Why is it okay to be very interested in and descriptive and study in depth the behavior of blue jays or condors or porcupines or raccoons and have all manner of views or even opinions about these animals, but not okay to have the same range of views, opinions, and invest the same amount of time in studying human beings? And it's clear on some level that human beings have built up a resistance to actually looking at their underlying motivations. But it's 2023 now. I think we're at a time right now when it might be ripe to start doing that, even if it rubs people the wrong way. That the clinical probably, in the long term, is better than the Pollyannish, the BS, the veneer of civility, the pack of lies that we tell each other and tell everyone else for the sake of our own comfort, in order to get by for another day. Because that guy wasn't being helped by it, and the guy who lost the girlfriend because she monkey branched wasn't being helped by it. Better to learn and understand these things ultimately than to live in La La Land. And the only leg that the La La Land people have to stand on in this regard, in my humble opinion, is the risk of hurt feelings. Well, you're going to be hurt regardless living in this world. Things will hurt you. People will hurt you. Incidents will hurt you. This stuff, at the very least, is not directed at inflicting pain on you. It is clinical. It is dry. And people can feel a sense of hurt because, for whatever reason, maybe they missed out in terms of traits that are beneficial in terms of reproduction or what have you. But at the very least, it's not intentionally hurtful. It's simply observational. And I think it's a lot better than lying to people and pretending to people and saying, well, you shouldn't be so clinical. Human beings have a lot of autonomy. No, we don't. We don't have a lot of autonomy. We pretend we do, but we don't. That is far worse than saying, here's the situation. You're so-and-so short. Or generally speaking, these are the salary requirements that women expect. Or women behave in X way under certain circumstances, but in a different way under different circumstances. Yeah, maybe people don't like that. Maybe it rubs them the wrong way. But what's more valuable in terms of being able to navigate your personal situation and, on a macroscopic scale, the situation at large in society? So I think it's well worth it being labeled cold or callous or indifferent to people's feelings if the price I pay for that is to be, at the very least, in my observations, in as much as I can be accurate and correct about these observations, to simply be right about what I'm observing and describing. It's going to be more beneficial to me. It's going to be more beneficial to others. And by the way, clinical doesn't mean you don't care. You can be a brain surgeon and have intimate knowledge of the structures of the human brain and care about your patients, although many don't for very interesting reasons, but nonetheless, you could. And you could apply that clinical knowledge, that precision knowledge, to saving people by operating on their brains. Being clinical doesn't mean you don't give a damn. It just means that you want to avail yourselves of tools that are actually useful. I think this is a point that a lot of people miss out on and just don't get. I think clinical means cold. You don't care. Sometimes it comes off that way, but rarely is it actually the case. Most of the time, it's a much more useful tool that's trying to get at the truth, the underlying facts, rather than pretending that something is a certain way. You say, it is this way. Let's not pretend otherwise. And you can absolutely use this knowledge in an effort to help people. Anyway, special thanks to my patrons and donors, as always. And if I'm still alive, I will check you out later. Everyone, if you can do the usual YouTube jazz, like, share, comment, subscribe, blah, blah, blah. Very much appreciated. And as always, may the gods watch over you. Check you out next time. Take care. Bye-bye.